You're lying in bed at night. The room is quiet, but your mind isn't. A conversation from earlier keeps replaying in your head. Someone said something a little rude. A comment that crossed the line just enough to sting. In the moment, you laughed it off. You didn't want to make things awkward. You didn't want to start a conflict. So you smiled, changed the subject, moved on. But now, hours later, your brain keeps rewinding the scene. What did they actually mean by that? Why did they say it like that? And the question that bothers you the most, why didn't I say anything? If you've ever experienced this, you're not alone. A lot of people do this. They stay polite, they stay calm, they avoid confrontation. And yet, strangely enough, they often seem to be the ones who get disrespected the most. Which raises an interesting question. Why do some people seem to attract disrespect more than others? And an even stranger one. Why does staying nice sometimes make the problem worse?
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes kindness sends the wrong signal. Not because kindness is bad, but because silence can be misinterpreted. When someone says something slightly disrespectful and you simply laugh it off, something subtle happens in that moment. Your brain thinks, I'm keeping the peace, but the other person might interpret it very differently. They may think, this person won't push back. And once that signal appears, the dynamic between you quietly shifts. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough for the next comment to go a little further. Then a little further after that. And here's the interesting part. Rude people are often surprisingly good at detecting this. Almost like a social radar. They test small boundaries first. A joke, a teasing comment, a slight insult, just enough to see what happens next. Here's how it usually works. Most people don't start with obvious disrespect. They start small. A joke that goes just a little too far. A casual comment about something you did wrong. A teasing remark that makes everyone else laugh. On the surface, it looks harmless. Just a joke. Just a comment. Just a moment. But in reality, something else is happening. They're testing a boundary. Not always consciously, but almost instinctively. Human beings are surprisingly good at reading social signals. We're constantly scanning the room. Who pushes back? Who stays quiet? Who absorbs the tension? And that small moment when you laugh it off, when you smile and say nothing, is often the moment they quietly decide how far they can go. Not necessarily in a cruel way. Sometimes it's almost automatic. But once that boundary is tested and nothing happens, the line starts to move. Just a little. And if you think about it, you've probably seen this before. Maybe with a coworker. Maybe with a friend. Maybe with someone who always seems to make the same kind of jokes. The kind that somehow always land on the same person. But there's another layer to this. Because sometimes the issue isn't just boundaries. It's empathy. Some people genuinely struggle to understand how their words affect others. Psychologists often connect this pattern to what are called narcissistic traits. Not necessarily full narcissistic personality disorder, but a tendency to see the world mostly through their own perspective. In their mental story, there's usually one main character. Themselves. Everyone else plays a smaller role. Coworker, friend, background character. So when you say something like, that comment actually hurt me, they may react with confusion. Not always because they're trying to be cruel, but because they genuinely don't see the situation the same way. From their perspective, they were just talking, just joking, just being honest. Which leads to a frustrating pattern many people recognize. You tell them something bothered you, and they respond with the same kinds of phrases. You're too sensitive. It was just a joke. You're overthinking it. And if you've ever heard those words before, you might have wondered something. Why do they always say the same thing? And the phrases tend to sound almost identical. You're too sensitive. It was just a joke. You're overreacting. Sometimes they even say it with a smile, as if the problem isn't what they said, but how you reacted to it.
And if you've heard those lines before, something interesting might happen right now. You might suddenly recognize the pattern. The same tone, the same excuses, the same dismissal of how you felt, almost like they're reading from the same script. And in that moment, many people have a quiet realization. That's exactly what they say.
But not all disrespect comes from a lack of empathy. Sometimes it comes from something else. Insecurity. There's a second type of person who often puts others down. People who feel the need to lower someone else just to feel a little higher themselves. And here's an interesting psychological pattern. Truly confident people rarely need to humiliate anyone. They don't gain anything from it. They're not looking for proof that they're better than someone else. But people who feel uncertain about their own worth often behave very differently. For them, comparison becomes a kind of emotional shortcut. If someone else looks smaller, they feel bigger. You can think of it like a leaking bucket. No matter how much confidence they try to pour into themselves, it keeps draining out. So instead, they try something easier. They poke holes in other people's buckets. They criticize. They mock. They make small comments that slowly lower someone else's standing in the room. And here's the part many people don't realize at first. The person who mocks you might actually envy something about you. Maybe your kindness. Maybe your calm presence. Maybe your discipline. Maybe the quiet confidence you carry without trying to prove it. Sometimes the very thing they attack is the thing they wish they had. But there's a third type, and this one is the most dangerous, because their behavior isn't accidental. It's strategic. Some people don't disrespect you because they're impulsive or insecure. They do it because it gives them control. Psychologists often see this pattern in environments where power matters, the workplace, romantic relationships, even within families. And one of the most common tools they use is something called gaslighting. It usually doesn't start dramatically. It starts small. First, a little criticism. You always mess this up. Then a little doubt. Are you sure you understood that correctly? Then something more personal. I don't think you're good at this. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your confidence starts to shift. You begin questioning your own memory, your own judgment, your own ability. That's the goal. Because once someone begins doubting themselves, they become much easier to control. But here's the disturbing part. Something counterintuitive often happens in these situations. The more someone disrespects you, the more you may start trying to please them. You work harder. You try to prove yourself. You hope that if you just do better, they'll finally approve of you. And that's exactly the dynamic manipulators rely on. At this point, a natural reaction might be, so what should I do when someone disrespects me? Most people assume the answer is simple. Fight back. Defend yourself. Show them they can't talk to you that way. But here's the psychological trap. Rude people often feed on emotional reactions, not always consciously, but emotionally. When someone gets angry, when they look embarrassed, when they start defending themselves, the other person suddenly feels something powerful. Influence. They see that their words can move you, that a single comment can shift your mood, change the atmosphere, even control the direction of the conversation. And once that dynamic appears, something subtle happens. The power balance changes. Because the moment someone can control your emotional reaction, they have a kind of leverage over you. And that realization leads to an important insight. Reacting emotionally doesn't always protect your boundaries. Sometimes, it actually gives the other person more power. So if reacting emotionally gives the other person power, what's the alternative? One surprisingly effective technique is something very simple, the 3-second pause. When someone says something rude or disrespectful, most people react immediately. They defend themselves, they explain, they argue. But instead of responding right away, try something different. Pause. Just for a few seconds. Look at them calmly. No anger, no nervous laughter, no rushed explanation. Just silence. At first, it may feel uncomfortable.
But something interesting often happens in that moment. The energy of the conversation shifts, because the reaction they expected never arrives. That silence removes the reward they were waiting for. No emotional explosion, no defensive speech, just a quiet pause that makes the room suddenly feel different. And many people become surprisingly uncomfortable in that silence. They may start explaining themselves. They may soften their tone. They may even change the subject. But that raises another interesting question. What happens if silence alone isn't enough?
When silence isn't enough, there's another technique that can be surprisingly powerful. A simple question. Calm, neutral, almost curious. You might say something like, "Sorry, I might have misunderstood. Were you talking to me just now?" The tone matters here. Not sarcastic, not aggressive. Just calm and direct. What this question does is subtle but powerful. It shifts the spotlight. Instead of you defending yourself, the other person suddenly has to explain what they meant. And in that moment, something interesting happens. Their words, which may have sounded casual or harmless a few seconds ago, suddenly become very clear when they have to repeat them. Sometimes they backtrack. Sometimes they say, "I was just joking." Sometimes they quickly change the subject. But either way, the dynamic has shifted, because now the responsibility for the comment sits with them. And this leads to an important realization. Setting boundaries doesn't always require aggression. Sometimes it only requires clarity. So if we step back and look at the bigger picture, a few important patterns start to appear. First, kindness without boundaries can sometimes invite disrespect. Not because kindness is weak, but because silence can be misunderstood. Second, some people genuinely struggle with empathy. They don't always recognize the impact of their words the way others do. Third, many insults don't come from confidence at all. They come from insecurity. Sometimes people put others down simply to feel a little more stable themselves. And finally, emotional control is one of the strongest forms of protection in social situations. Not reacting impulsively, not giving away your emotional balance, can quietly change the entire dynamic of an interaction. Which leads to one final insight. Being kind doesn't mean being defenseless. Kindness and boundaries can exist at the same time. And maybe the goal isn't to become colder or harsher with people. Maybe it's simply to redirect your kindness, not toward people who constantly disrespect you, but toward yourself.